Well, America has a long and difficult history of race. Despite the election of its first black president, the country remains often bitterly and deeply divided. The Trayvon Martin case has brought this simmering tension back to the boil. Earlier, I spoke to US studies expert Dr. David Smith from Sydney University about what this case tells us about American society. David Smith, thank you very much for joining me here on Newsnight. What sort of a challenge do you think that this Zimmerman ruling really presents to America right now when it comes to race relations?
Well, it's really exposed the fact that the criminal justice system for a long time has been one of the most racially discriminatory institutions in the United States. Now, the jury didn't get the verdict wrong. Given the facts that they had in front of them, they made the decision that they had to make. But all the way through this case, there were these markers of racial prejudice that are something that are very familiar to African Americans. The fact,
in fact, it really began at the start, didn't it, with the suspicion of Trayvon Martin from George Zimmerman in the first place?
That's absolutely right. And that's a form of everyday racial profiling that nearly all black men have to live with. And the fact that once the police actually took George Zimmerman in for questioning, and they basically accepted his story of self-defence without really investigating it properly as a homicide should be investigating, this, to many people, is going to be seen as a typical kind of presumption of black male criminality that meant that a black death could just be explained away. So certainly all the way through this case, and even going to the fact that the judge forbade the use of the term racial profiling in the case, though that was clearly in a sort of everyday sense what had actually gone on. For many people, this really just exposes the fact that the criminal justice system seems to serve African Americans, both as suspects, offenders and victims, far more poorly than it serves other people.
If you take race out of the equation here, though, you're left with two witnesses to this, one who's dead, one who's in the dock. The claim of Zimmerman that he was attacked, the law of Florida, which allows someone to use excessive force in the event that they're attacked and they're defending themselves legally, race aside, this would appear clear-cut, wouldn't it?
Yes, I mean, as I say, there was nothing else that the jury could have done in this case, especially proving murder. That's an extremely high bar to clear and one that the prosecution never came clearing. Even manslaughter in this case, and the prosecution initially didn't press manslaughter charges, which a lot of people view as a mistake, but it was allowed as an option at the end. But even manslaughter in this case would have required the state to prove that George Zimmerman was not acting in self-defence, which was impossible to prove. Even though Zimmerman was the one who, whatever happened, it's undeniable that he actually initiated the confrontation that resulted in the shot being fired. The criminal law is that unless the state could actually disprove that at some point he was acting in self-defence, then he was not guilty. So this was not an unexpected verdict.
And also, which may mitigate the racial claims in this, it was also poorly handled by the prosecution. How does that relate to race? Would it have been better investigated? Would the prosecution have been more competent? Would it have been handled better if Trayvon Martin was a white person?
What a lot of people in the United States are saying is that if out of that brawl Trayvon Martin was the one who had emerged alive and George Zimmerman was dead, this would have been handled very differently. There would have been a homicide investigation underway immediately. There would have been far more scepticism cast immediately on any assertion that Trayvon Martin might have made that he was acting in self-defence. This probably would have played out very differently if the racial roles had been reversed. And we should note that George Zimmerman does not identify as white.
No, he's Peruvian, I think, background.
Yes, he identifies as being of Peruvian background. But what this case really shows is that of all the minorities in the United States, African Americans are very much at the bottom when it comes to treatment by the criminal justice system. And this case will contribute to all the statistics that show not only that black offenders are treated much more harshly by the criminal justice system, but also that offenders of any race who commit a crime against a black victim are treated much more leniently by the criminal justice system.
And this is meant to be in what is in the Obama era seen as a post-racial America.
That's exactly right. And this is one of those incidents that exposes that at the sharp end of things, it is not post-racial at all. A huge number of African Americans, especially black men, come into contact with the criminal justice system at some point quite early in their lives. This is one of the ways in which many black Americans feel that the system is completely rigged against them, because if they do something wrong when they're young, they don't get second chances. And I mean, this is the worst possible case of a young black man not getting a second chance and perhaps not even having done anything wrong at all. We'll never know whether he actually attacked George Zimmerman as Zimmerman claims, and even if he did, it seems that he would have been the one who had a lot more to be afraid of that night.
What challenges does this present to Barack Obama as well, being the first black American president, but someone who has been, perhaps you could even say, uncomfortable when it comes to raising racial issues in the White House, and certainly when he's got involved in racial issues, it hasn't worked out well for him.
No, it has not. I mean, the first time that he intervened on a racial issue was when a black professor called Henry Louis Gates was arrested by police while trying to get into his own house, which Obama described as stupid, and he was immediately pounced upon for playing the race card. He didn't say anything again about race until the Trayvon Martin case, when he said that if he had a son, he would look like Trayvon Martin. A rather mild expression of solidarity, but once again one that provoked this furious reaction that Obama was somehow politicising the case and playing the race card. And he's been fairly silent on matters of race ever since. He's been silent on this case ever since, in fact, although now he's appealing for calm. And I think that what this shows is that there's very little that the president can actually do about reforming the criminal justice system. And that is why racial discrimination is so persistent, because this is a very difficult system to reform. If anything, at the federal level, Barack Obama might be accused of actually making things worse for African Americans by ramping up the drug war, which disproportionately affects people of colour, especially African Americans. But most of this issue happens at the state level in terms of the judiciary, and at the very local level in terms of law enforcement. And I think that Barack Obama knows there's really very little he can actually do about that.
But to even raise racial issues, there's a strange inversion of this now in the United States, where in the supposedly post-racial era, even raising something as being racist is seen as being racist. It's a strange conundrum where people can barely even raise the issue without being seen to contribute to the issue.
That's exactly right. There's this very powerful discourse of anti-racism, which is almost like a new form of political correctness, where when African Americans complain about the persistence of racism, there will be usually white conservative commentators who then claim that they're stirring up racial problems, and who claim that, well, really everyone harbours animosity to other groups, and so African American resentment towards whites about centuries of injustice and mistreatment, really that's just as bad as whites who are racist, completely ignoring the power structure in American society that consistently rigs the game against blacks. But that's just seen as so impolite to actually talk about it, that even someone like Barack Obama is terrified of actually raising this as an issue.
David, what is it about America, a country that is founded on a notional equality, that has seen extraordinary bloodletting, the Civil War partly fought over the issue of slavery? We saw the civil rights movement in the 1960s, hard-won gains, but still has this schism when it comes to race in the country. What is it peculiarly to America that racial issues occupy such a prominence and also such a sensitivity?
Well, the past does cast a very long shadow, and even though most of the formal structures of discrimination have been removed, there are still massive barriers in the way of African Americans. One of the major legacies, for example, of legal segregation was that there's still an enormous amount of residential segregation in the United States. For the most part, whites and blacks lead separate lives. And for African Americans, that often means living in neighbourhoods where there's a very low tax base, where the public school system is shot to pieces, where discipline in schools, for example, is basically subcontracted out to the police and the prison system, where they have very little access to basic amenities like public transport and grocery shopping. Now, living in those circumstances automatically puts every young black person growing up at a substantial disadvantage, and they're very aware of this fact. But it's the lack of white awareness of this fact. It's the fact that whites either don't know about or want to ignore the reality of their own privilege. This is one of the things that creates a really sore divide in American life, because African Americans are very resentful of white privilege, and whites are resentful of African Americans being resentful of white privilege. So if this schism is ever to be overcome, one of the first steps will be a greater awareness among white Americans of their own racial privilege. And I have to say that it may be particularly acute in the United States, but this isn't unique to the United States at all.
Just further then, David, while racism is not unique to the United States, there is this contradiction when you can have, on the one hand, a black American elected as president, while on the other hand, someone like Trayvon Martin, allegedly here, not being treated fairly in the justice system. How do you explain that?
Well, I think that the answer to this is that whenever political reforms improve life for minorities, the greatest improvements always come to those who already have a certain amount of privilege, who come from more middle-class backgrounds, who have more access to education and things like that. So for a couple of generations now, members of the black middle classes have been benefiting a lot from post-civil rights policies, and they're finding that there's a lot less discrimination against them now than there used to be, although substantial discrimination still exists. The improvements are slowest for people who are not only members of minorities, but who are poor, who lack access to education, and who come from families that exhibit those traits as well. It is far harder for them to actually enjoy the benefits of these post-civil rights policies. There's a book that I would recommend called The New Jim Crow, which looks, for example, at incarceration policies in the South. And it suggests that because of mass incarceration of young black men, which in the South, in a lot of southern states, has the political consequence of disenfranchisement for a long time, it essentially means that there's an entire generation of young black men who are not that much better off now in the post-civil rights era than they would have been in the pre-civil rights era. So despite the fact that those formal legal structures of discrimination have been dismantled, new structures have replaced them that are equally destructive to people's lives and communities.
David Smith, a real pleasure to have you on the program. Thank you again for that.
My pleasure.
We'll take a